Well, hello everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in about 60 seconds. We'll give folks a minute to get logged in. Okay, we're still waiting for several people to join. So we'll give everyone about 30 more seconds and then we'll get going. Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us today for our session on diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Liza Town. I'm an HR consultant. I'm actually in the Omaha, Nebraska area. Um, so I see a few familiar names from other sessions we've had over the last couple months. So welcome to those of you I've spoken with before, and good to virtually meet you to those that I have not. So a couple housekeeping items before we jump into our session today. Participants are muted during the broadcast today for noise reduction, et cetera. So if you have any comments throughout the session or anything to contribute, I'd love it. Go ahead and use the chat tool in your Zoom webinar toolbar. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of today's broadcast. If you have any questions regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or any of the topics or ideas that we discussed today, go ahead and put those in that Q&A tool. It's right in the middle of your Zoom toolbar. You can also ask questions anonymously. There's a little box to check in that Q&A tool when you're asking your question if you would like to remain anonymous, and that is just fine. Um, and without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right in. So thank you again for attending today's session on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So at a high level, here's what we would like to cover off on today. So first, we're going to discuss, why we're here and why this is such an important topic. Second, we'll talk about what you need to know about diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies and best practices. And finally, how you can help create an intentional culture with positive diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes. So here's what we want to accomplish together today. We're going to talk about how to understand the bottom line outcomes that result from a strong diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. There are definite positives for the business with these practices. We'll give you the tools that you need to contribute to a thriving culture, empower you to create an inclusive work environment that's comfortable and encourages creativity, innovation, and diversity in thought, and will help your organization move towards a true transformation. So why do diversity, equity, and inclusion matter? So let's take a look at some data. Now, first, McKinsey has been examining diversity in the workplace for several years. So in their latest report called Diversity Matters, they found that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So there is real financial impact on businesses that incorporate DE&I practices. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity also had were 15% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So, and along with financial returns, DE&I practices can also help you to expand your customer base. So, Accenture reports that 70% of millennial age consumers are more likely to choose one brand over another if that brand demonstrates inclusion and diversity in its products or its services, promotions, etc. Customers, vendors, and other business partners look for organizations that understand an increasingly diverse and multicultural consumer base and can demonstrate cultural intelligence. We'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that, and that are aligned by shared values. So, really, the more diverse your team is, the more likely you will be to demonstrate empathy and understanding towards a diverse customer base. And that is definitely likely to expand your customer base over time. We also want to help organizations attract top talent. So, Glassdoor reports that 72% of women versus 62% of men, 89% of African Americans, 80% of Asians, 70% of Latinos ranked workforce diversity as paramount in their job search. We're also becoming an increasingly diverse and multicultural society overall. So, um, this is from CNN and the US Census Bureau. Um, Only 56% of the 87 million millennials in the US are white, and that is compared to 72% of all baby boomers. So we're becoming a less white and more multicultural country overall, and organizations that keep up with those trends in their hiring, in their advertising, promoting, et cetera, are going to do better over time. So, diversity in the workforce means having a multitude of different cultures, educational backgrounds, and points of view present. So, these cultural, educational, and conceptual perspectives provide richness of ideas, right, that lead to stronger outcomes, making diversity a proven ingredient of creativity and innovation. Conversely, a lack of diversity in the leadership of an organization really hampers innovation, and it prohibits members of minority groups from being recognized for their contributions. So, a Harvard study showed that in companies that don't have that diverse leadership, women are 20% less likely than straight white men to win endorsement for their ideas. People of color are 24% less likely, and those that identify as LGBTQ are 21% less likely than their straight white counterparts to win endorsement for their ideas. So when we have a group at work, leadership or the entire workforce being monocultural, right, where most people are coming from the same cultural background, um, we're more susceptible to what we call groupthink, right? So we're all coming from the same background, and we're all kind of attacking ideas and problems the same way, right? Because we have kind of the same way of thinking about things. Um, when we have diversity in the workforce, though, that gives you kind of multiple backgrounds and multiple sources of inspiration, points of view, and it makes it easier for companies to stay out of that group think that can really drag an organization down over time. So we've looked at some basic statistics. Let's walk through some definitions, right? So diversity, equity, and inclusion are part of the same strategy overall, but they're each unique terms and unique concepts that come with unique strategies. So people tend to use these terms interchangeably or kind of lump them all together. And we don't have to do that. So diversity is the representation of different thoughts, opinions, and types of people within an organization. And then inclusion means that individuals with different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted and welcomed in that organization. So not only are they present, but they're accepted, they're welcomed, they're part of the fold, right? And equity is when everyone in the organization receives fair and equal treatment and has access to opportunities. So workplace diversity, as I alluded to, does not necessarily equal workplace inclusion. So this is just kind of a simple, picture description of that, right? So on the left, you have a description of diversity. You've got all the puzzle pieces. they're all different colors. It's beautiful, fantastic. But when you add inclusion, everything starts to kind of fit together and work together. And everyone from different backgrounds, et cetera, feels included and feels part of the team and can work cohesively. So diversity in the workplace means that an organization employs a diverse team of people, right? So it's more than just race or gender, though, right? We should take into account things like nationality, age, educational level, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, etc. So there are lots of different ways to, increase diversity in an organization. So, a little food for thought. You can mandate diversity, but you can't mandate inclusion. Inclusion is about behavior and relationships. You have to change hearts and minds. So, this to me is really poignant quote because it really, it drives home the fact that you can have a diverse workforce, you can have, diverse population, but if folks aren't being included, if their ideas aren't being listened to, et cetera, in the workplace, you don't have inclusion. And that's what makes all the difference, right? And there is really an intersection between equity and inclusion as well. So, inclusion is the achievement of a work environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully. And they also have equal access to opportunities and resources and can contribute fully to the organization's success. So equality means equal opportunity, whereas equity means equal access. So in this image, the person on the left is taller, which is a privilege in this situation, right? They're able to reach what the shortest person cannot. In the image on the right, when the less privileged are armed with the resources that offer the same opportunities as their peers, fairness is achieved. So, in other words, equality is the end goal, and equity is the means to get there to that goal. So, when we're talking about concepts like inclusion, concepts like equity in the workplace, I think it's really important to take a step back and talk about bias, right? We're going to do a little activity and then we're going to talk about bias. Now, normally, if I were face to face with you, I would have a handout, right? And the handout that I would give you would look very similar to this. So we're going to do this. If you have a pen or a piece of paper handy, fantastic. Go ahead and write this out. If not, do it in your head, right? What I would like you to do is identify the names of the 5 people that are closest to you. So not family members, though, but your friends, the folks that you've chosen to surround yourself with. So your 5 closest friends, and then identify their characteristics. What age group are they in? Are they all male? Or are they all female, etc.? What's their race, sexual orientation, level of education? Are they married or not? Do they have kids or not? Kind of think through that, right? And then what we're going to do, I'm going to launch a poll here. And what I would like you to do is just tell me, and this poll is anonymous, I won't be able to see who said what. How similar are your 5 closest friends to you? Are they very similar to you, somewhat similar, or are they not at all similar to you? And we'll give everyone, another 30 seconds or so to get your vote in. And thank you to those of you that have participated already. Votes are coming in fast and furious. We might not need all 30 seconds. So fantastic. I'm going to end this poll and then I'll share my results. Share the results. So 57% of you said that your 5 closest friends are very similar to you, right? 43 said they are somewhat similar to you. So here's the reason why we do this exercise. It's really to drive home the point that intention really matters, right? We tend to surround ourselves with people that are very similar to us, right? Similar backgrounds, similar life experiences. We're on similar paths in life, and that's fine, right? It's human nature. However, if we want to, do the work of um, understanding folks with different backgrounds and being more inclusive, we really have to set our intention to go out and interact with folks that aren't quite as, as similar as you. So, a little food for thought there. And let's go ahead and jump into our discussion on bias. So I want to talk about implicit versus explicit bias, right? So implicit or unconscious bias is a term used to describe the associations that we hold, right? That even though they're outside of our conscious awareness can have a significant influence on our attitudes and our behavior. So regardless of how fair-minded we believe ourselves to be, most people have some degree of unconscious bias on board. That doesn't mean we're racist or sexist or xenophobic. We have these biases that we've grown up with, right? So what that means is that we automatically respond to others, people from different racial or ethnic groups, for example, in either positive or negative ways based on the biases that we hold. And these associations are really hard to override, regardless of whether we recognize them to be wrong, because they're deeply ingrained into our thinking and our emotions. So, on the left hand side of the screen, you see unconscious or implicit bias, right? And that operates, like we said, outside of the person's awareness. And it can really feel like it's in direct contradiction to our espoused beliefs and value system. Conscious bias, on the other hand, or explicit bias, um, means that the person is really clear about their feelings and attitudes, right? Um, their related behaviors are conducted with intent. Conscious bias, a lot of the time, is characterized by really overt negative behavior, or it can be more subtle means, such as exclusion of folks that are different, etc. So here's what we know about the science on unconscious bias. These kinds of biases develop at an early age. So they emerge during middle childhood and appear to develop across childhood. So we pick up thoughts and ideas about different groups by watching and listening to the people around us, right? Maybe it's our parents, older siblings, teachers, the media, right? And we get ideas about what groups of people are like. And are they inherently good, are they inherently bad? For example, kids don't have a lot of room for gray area at young ages. So um, we pick these things up in early childhood, and we know that they can have real world effects on our behavior going forward. Um, the good news story here is that unconscious biases are malleable. So we can take steps to minimize the impact of unconscious bias in our lives. So we also know that there's a lot of research published around the impact of unconscious bias in various domains, right? So the criminal justice system, policing, education, healthcare, and we also know that bias can have an impact on hiring and mentoring. So it does have an impact on the workplace. Um, so a couple studies that I want to point out. And the first one, a bunch of fake resumes with white sounding names, right, and African American sounding names were sent in response to a job posting. So there were no real substantial material differences in the qualifications of these fake resumes. It's just the names, right? But the resumes with the white sounding names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. And another study, hiring managers for a lab manager position rated the male candidates much more competent than their equally skilled female candidates. And then they took it a step further, and the hiring managers selected higher starting salaries and offered more career mentoring opportunities to the male candidates. So, we say unconscious bias. So the question, how can I address my biases if I don't know that I have them? It's a relevant, fair question, right? But we're having this conversation today, and folks are more and more willing to be open and talk about unconscious bias, own their own biases, and do something about it, right? So this is kind of the first step of that process. If you want to be part of fostering an inclusive world, it truly does start with our own work, right? So let's talk about some steps that we can take to combat unconscious bias in ourselves. Um, Step one, just assume that you have unconscious bias on board, right? Because we all do to some regard. Step two, conduct some research on yourself, right? So think about what are some behaviors that suggest you might have some hidden bias about particular groups. If you're in a position to make hiring decisions at work, do you hire the same type of people all the time? Do you find racial, ethnic, gender, LGBT differences something that you would rather not talk about or address? Do you use the term "I'm colorblind"? Um, do you laugh at jokes about other groups? In step three, make a list of groups that are different from you and your group. So, I said before, it's human nature to be more positive about the groups that we're a part of, right? Surround ourselves with people that are like us. But when you're thinking about groups that are different from your own, do you interact much with those groups? Do you know much about those groups other than, the bias that you have on board, other than kind of what is pushed out in the media, et cetera? Um, and then step four, you've done the research on yourself. Now ask a friend or an associate, right, how they perceive you. So this can be a really hard, difficult ask, right? But I think most of us know that person that will give it to us straight. So tell them it's important, ask for their honest feedback, and see if they have anything to say about any behaviors that they've noticed in you that would suggest that you might have some unconscious bias on board about a particular group. And step five, I would encourage you to take a look at your worldview. How do you see things, right? Are things really black and white for you? Do you see right and wrong, good and bad? um, or are you able to see the gray areas? Are you able to think in more relative terms? If something is not right for you, can you understand how it could still be right for someone else? When you see things that are different than the way you would behave, dress, speak, etc., do you interpret them from your own cultural lens as, weird, strange, different, making you uncomfortable, or are you able to describe them in more neutral terms until you have additional information? Another way to test yourself for biases is to take what's called an implicit association test, or an IAT. One website that we recommend is understandingprejudice.org. And you will get a copy of this presentation, so no worries if you don't have anything to write that down with. But they have different implicit association tests that you can take. The screen shows race and gender, for example. So let's talk about how do we, learn to appreciate differences. I think it starts most often by talking about it, acknowledging the differences in each other. A statistic that kind of slapped me in the face was 43% of workers in the US still think that discussions about race are inappropriate at work. You know, and that's unfortunate. If we don't talk about a problem, how can we address it and move past it, right? As a culture. Being colorblind disregards our remarkable differences. So, by being open to discussing race and ethnicity, other ways that we are different in the workplace, employers can begin to have honest conversations about our unique differences and experiences. And that's okay, that's a good thing. So, let's talk about race versus ethnicity. Um, Both race and ethnicity have been used to subjugate people, to persecute people. Ignoring this fact uh, according to Samantha Vincenti, denies the lived experiences of other people. So you think about ways that race and ethnicity have subjugated people, persecuted people. Um, and, we think about our country's history with slavery. We think about the way Catholic Americans or Irish people were treated and seen as less than, right, when they first came to this country. And there's a lot to unpack here. So let's start with just kind of some basic definitions. Race is biological, while ethnicity is cultural. Race is usually associated with biology and linked with physical characteristics, like our skin color, the texture of our hair, and it usually can't be hidden, right? Ethnicity, on the other hand, is more linked to cultural expression. So it can be displayed or hidden. Um, Ethnicity can be adopted, ignored, broadened, while racial characteristics are what they are, right? Um, Ethnicity still has subcategories, while races no longer do. Um, some sociologists believe that racial divisions are based more on sociological concepts and concepts about ethnicity than the actual race and the biological principles that go along with race. It's kind of interesting. So let's talk about microaggressions. Now, the concept of microaggressions can be applied to more than just race and ethnicity, right? People in the LGBTQ community, women, those with disabilities, etc., all experience microaggressions as well. So kind of keep that in mind, right? There are three different types or forms of microaggressions. So the first would be a micro assault, right? Um, these happen when a person purposely behaves or speaks in a racist way, sexist way, etc., or uses racist symbols. An example of a micro assault would be when a coworker makes a racist joke, um, being aware that the joke is racist, right? But claims that the joke is harmless. It's a micro assault. It's not like they come up and slap their coworker in the face, right? But it's still there. It still stings. Um, it also includes never acknowledging a Black employee during a meeting, for example, ignoring a Black coworker's attempts at sharing an idea, having a manager keep a close eye on a Black employee, etc. Right? A micro insult is when a verbal or a nonverbal behavior that demeans a person's race and expresses rudeness and insensitivity, right? So, an example of a micro insult could be, um, a white coworker asking a Black coworker how she was able to get her job. So the implied meaning there is you didn't get the job on your own merits, right? You're here because you're Black. You're, the diversity hire, right? Um, People who use micro insults can either be really aware of their racism or their bias, or it could be coming from a place of unconscious bias. Either way, not cool, right? And then a micro invalidation, that that's a form of communication that attempts to negate, exclude, or ignore a person based on their difference, right? Their race, etc. People that give out micro invalidations usually deny that they're being racist, right? For example, a white coworker might ask a Black coworker where he's from, something that she wouldn't ask of her white coworkers, right? The implied meaning is you don't belong here. Look how different you are. So often, when someone hears or experiences a microaggression, they experience an internal dilemma, right? So, did I hear what I think I just heard? Um, am I interpreting that correctly, right? And then, should I say something about that? And so, for their part, sometimes well meaning bystanders who have noticed it are concerned that, saying something might only make it worse, or that speaking up would add more hurt than it might help. Um, but to the person that's directly on the receiving end of a microaggression, they're likely experiencing this wave of emotions, including humiliation and helplessness. They might also be thinking, wait, did I interpret that correctly? And they're trying to work through that quickly, and down the road, though, when you experience more and more of these microaggressions, those feelings can result in anxiety, depression, diminished self-confidence, etc. Also, racial and gender microaggressions can and do compound. So that ultimately creates an inhospitable work environment and can lead to attrition and losing really great people to work with. So there are many good reasons to confront microaggressions in real time as they happen. And these reasons are both for the offended person and the person, the offender, right? So these include helping the offender who might have some unconscious bias on board and might not have realized what their comment or their action just did. Um, Realize their bias, change their behavior. And you're also protecting that person, that coworker, that peer, etc., and setting a norm that the behavior that you just witnessed is not tolerable, it's not acceptable. So some things that you can do to combat microaggressions in real time, first and foremost, ask a clarifying question. So if your first thought is, did I interpret that correctly? Ask them to clarify themselves. um, Come from a place of curiosity, instead of saying, I can't believe you just said that. Hey, is this what you said? Is that what you meant to say? And, come from a place of curiosity and then listen to them, listen to what they have to say in reply. Um, you could talk to other people about your experience. So here's what I noticed and what just happened, right? And encourage others to consider the impact of the words that they say or the actions that they take. Ask them to think about, how do you think people feel when you say that, when you do this? And then instead of saying, hey, that person that you just, said that that horrible thing to, here's how they feel. Remember that you're owning your own response, right? So when I hear you say that, this is how that makes me feel, right? Let the person who was offended, the target of that comment, for example, own their own emotional response. And then finally, identify next steps for that person, request appropriate action. I'd appreciate it if you would not do that anymore. I would appreciate it if you didn't make comments without thinking about them first, etc. Okay, so before we move on, I want to again just give you a quick reminder that we will have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So any of these topics are sparking curiosity, bringing up questions for you, go ahead and stick those in the Q&A for me. So let's talk about creating a gender inclusive work environment. So we'll start this discussion by talking about gender identity. This is our happy little gender unicorn here. So everyone has a gender identity. Most people never think about what their gender identity is much because it matches their sex at birth, and we kind of go along thinking that way. But let's talk first about some basic definitions, okay? So gender identity means an individual's personal sense of having a particular gender. Um, and then gender expression then is the way in which a person expresses that gender identity. So that's typically through the way they talk, dress, behave, etc. And then sexual orientation is really separate from gender identity. So that's why the gender unicorn, I think, is really helpful for this, because we talk first about gender identity. I could feel like a female, I could feel like a man, I could feel like a different gender or no gender, and then I could express myself in a feminine way, a masculine way, or a more androgynous way, etc. um, and then sexual orientation comes into play, because it talks about my identity in relation to the gender or the genders that I'm attracted to, right? Either physically attracted to or emotionally attracted to. So I can identify as female and express myself in a very feminine way. And then I also have my sexual orientation, right? So I could be attracted to women or other genders, or, physically and emotionally attracted to men. There's endless possibilities here. So let's talk about some terminology as it relates to gender and gender identity. So a birth name refers to the name that you're given at birth. A living name refers to a name that a transgender, non-binary, or a gender non-conforming person chooses to use. Dead naming is a term for calling a trans person who has chosen to change their birth name to a different living name by their former name. Now, not all trans folks, non-binary folks, etc., choose a new living name, right? That's not, a prerequisite for being transgendered. But for those that do choose a living name, it's incredibly disrespectful and demeaning to dead name that person by using their former birth name. Gender dysphoria is a term for, when a person experiences serious emotional distress due to the gender that they were assigned at birth, differing from the gender that they know themselves to be. So again, not all transgendered folks experience gender dysphoria, but for those that do, using incorrect pronouns on purpose or dead naming that person can really contribute to the stress of that situation. So how do we create a gender inclusive work environment? We can use terms like cisgender or cis when we're speaking about those who live as the sex that they were assigned at birth, instead of using terms like normal, right? That could feel really harmless, but it comes across as a micro invalidation, right? Normal could be considered even discriminatory, as it sets those who are not cisgendered apart and says, you are other, you are different, you're not the same as everyone else here. Using the correct pronouns is a really important way to show respect for a person's gender identity. You could consider adding a pronoun block to your email signature. I have one. So mine says Liza Town, principal consultant, and underneath that it says she dash her. Those are my pronouns. Some folks would prefer a gendered pronoun like he, him, she, her. Others prefer gender neutral terms such as they, them, or they could go back and forth, right, between gendered and gender neutral. And when you're in doubt about somebody's pronouns, just ask them, right? Create a culture where respecting that person outweighs discomfort. Now, one thing that I want to quickly point out is there's this whole concept of preferred pronouns, right? That concept really started out innocuously, as a way to ask somebody, what are your preferred pronouns? How do you prefer I address you, right? But some in the trans community take offense to that term and would prefer that somebody ask them just, what are your pronouns? And the reason for that is, everyone feels it's not what I prefer. These are my pronouns, right? I identify as female. I prefer female pronouns, but it's not, by saying, what do you prefer? It almost puts it to the person like it's an option, and it really shouldn't be. In the workplace, as soon as an employee announces their intent to transition, we should just be prepared to respect their choice of name, respect their pronouns, respect the restroom that they choose to use, etc. So I'm going to pause for a minute here, and I want to share this YouTube video with you. So this is kind of what it feels like when somebody is misgendered, right? When the appropriate pronouns aren't used, etc. Video's about 3 minutes long, so we'll play it and then we will discuss.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Wild and welcome to my channel, Ashley's Wild Life. This week on the Gender Resources playlist, what to do if you have accidentally misgendered someone. This video is inspired by the fact that I am misgendered almost constantly, and specifically motivated by something that happened to me this past week. I am in the waiting room at a doctor's office, waiting for the doctor to come out and tell me information about my mom. I've never seen the doctor before. She's never seen me before. We have only ever spoken on the phone. I am the only person in the waiting room, and suddenly a woman comes in, so I say, "Hi." She looks around the room and says, "Hi," and then leaves. Then I get a phone call, and it's the doctor. She says, "Hey, I'm not sure where you are. I looked for you in the waiting room." I'm like, "Well, I'm in the waiting room." So she says, "Oh, I must have missed you," and she comes back. And she looks at me, and what she decides to say is, "Hey, pretty lady." What? This story sparked something for me. And what it sparked for me is how uncomfortable it makes people to treat trans individuals like regular human beings. If you misgender someone, you should treat it the way you would treat anything that you accidentally do that is rude. If you're a waitress and you're serving a table and you accidentally step on the toe of the customer, you don't stop and be like, "Great shoes." No, you politely apologize for stepping on their toe and you get back to the business of being a waitress. It was so uncomfortable and so isolating in that moment to feel like on top of misgendering me, which was an accident, but it still doesn't feel good. Now you're overcompensating, trying to get on my good side. This is a different conversation if we're talking about friends or family or someone who you are going to have a lasting relationship with, but this is a functional situation. Don't get on my good side. Apologize for the rude thing that you did, and then go back to treating me like a regular human being. I don't need a doctor to tell me I'm a pretty lady. I need a doctor to tell me how my mom is doing. I need you to treat me the same way you would treat anybody else. It's embarrassing when you realize that you've misgendered someone. And I get it. It's awkward. You don't know what to do. So here's what you do. Just apologize and treat me like a regular person. Because gender isn't visible, because it's something that we feel and we know about ourselves, misgendering will probably always happen. If you want to avoid misgendering to the best of your ability, ask someone what their pronouns are and how they would want to be referred to. But in any case, we all make mistakes. So just, if you misgender someone and you're uncomfortable, don't make your discomfort that person's problem. Apologize and let it go. Thank you all for watching. Bye-bye.
Oh, okay. Apparently Ashley had to say bye-bye before I moved the slide. So Ashley has a great channel on YouTube, and I would highly encourage folks to go out there, and see what else they have to say. If you have questions about gender, about trans folks, etc., it's a really good resource. There's a lots of good resources out there. So I had one question in chat from Chelsea. I'm back in the meeting, but something is funky. Chelsea, nothing's funky on my end, so I don't know if anyone else is having issues with the meeting. Definitely let me know in chat. And keep in mind that we will send this recording out along with the deck after the call. Okay, so just want to point out, a couple do's and don'ts about gender. So, remember that assumptions kill inclusivity, right? So Ashley's gender in the video we just watched was assumed, and it was uncomfortable. And the person who accidentally misgendered Ashley maybe didn't handle it the best, right? So here's some do's and don'ts. So don't ask, what does your husband or wife do, right? Maybe instead ask, what does your partner do? Think about removing gender from your language when you can. Don't assume gender identity based on perceived sex, right? Somebody may look male, but really not feel male. Instead, ask, what are your pronouns? Don't ask invasive questions regarding a coworker's transition, right? If you know somebody that's transitioning, consider whether that question is something you really need to know or is it just a nice to know. And if it's a nice to know, maybe go out and educate yourself, right? Okay, so let's talk about generational differences before we wrap up our session today. So, in a multi-generational workplace, there are some things that we really have to be aware of, right? This is the first time in US history that we've had five different generations working side by side together. Um, each generation has distinct attitudes, behaviors, expectations, etc., right? Um, there's a lot of research that indicates that people communicate based on their generational backgrounds more than they communicate based on, cultural or ethnic backgrounds. So generational differences are really important. So here is kind of a breakdown of the generations that are in the workplace today. So the largest group being the millennials right now. So 35% of the workforce in the US is millennial. And those are folks that were born from 1981 to 2000. Next, you have Gen X, right? 33%. And then those are folks that were born between 1965 and 1980. You have 25% of the workforce is baby boomers, folks born between 1946 and 1964. And then you have Gen Z. So these are our youngest folks in the workforce, folks that were born between 2001 and are still being born today. And then 2% of the workforce is still traditionalist, folks born between 1925 and 1945. So when we do this presentation in front of a group, we ask for folks to call out their answers. We can't really do that here, right, on a webinar. So, but kind of think this through with me, and I'll just walk through our list. So can you think about which generation would be considered the most self-sacrificing generation? That's going to be your traditionalists, right? Um, what generations appreciate immediate feedback? They want to know the good and the bad right now. Um, that's going to be your millennials and Gen Z. Oop, well, there you go. So I hit my button too soon, but all of the younger generations, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, really value that work-life balance. They're working to live instead of living to work. What generation is the most private and reserved? Traditionalists. Which generation is considered not really self-directed? And that's going to be millennials. What is the workaholic generation? Baby boomers. And the generation that values independence and individuality most is Gen Z. And what generations are most motivated by company loyalty? Those are going to be your traditionalists and your baby boomers. So keep in mind, these are generalizations, right? If you're in, a millennial and you say, well, I am too self-directed, it's just, these are generalizations. So don't take offense, it's just kind of an interesting way to look at how, folks change over time as generations go on. So, employers really, I think, need to look out for cultural clashes in age diverse employee populations because of what we just saw, right? You've got folks that really value company loyalty in the, traditionalist and baby boomer generation. Folks in younger generations, for example, are more inclined to, be less loyal to the company. Which is fine. It's just the way we are, right? It's the way people are. I say we because, that's silly. I'm certainly not a Gen Z person, but 86% of employees say that they've observed conflict or frustration at work caused by differences between generations. Sentiments and phrases like okay boomer or calling a woman a Karen could be taken as offensive and even ageist, right? We see these trends where, generations are clashing on social media. We have to be really careful that we don't bring that into the workplace. So, Hayden Shaw is an expert in generational differences in the workplace. So, Hayden says that statistical generalizations are an aid to conversation. Like I said, it's not a substitute for it, right? So, when we talk about what a generation is like overall, that's just supposed to kind of help us in our conversations. So, when it comes to understanding another person, nothing replaces the actual conversation. So instead of relying solely on data surrounding generational differences, it's important to have open conversations about what Hayden calls the sticking points, right? So the first step to understanding folks in different generations is to just acknowledge, right? Talk about the generational differences. You can't solve a problem if you don't acknowledge that it exists. The second step is to appreciate, focus on the why and not the what, and the common need. So the what is kind of what divides us, but the why is the uniter. Be willing to flex, agree on how to accommodate different approaches, um, and leverage, maximize the strengths of each generation. And finally, work to resolve. So determine which option is going to yield the best results if flexing and being accommodating isn't enough in a particular situation. So let's talk about how you can contribute to an inclusive work environment. Roy Disney says it's not hard to make decisions when you know what your values are. So we are all guided by our core values, right? And these should serve as your North Star for all workplace interactions, both internally and externally. So think about your organizational values. Couple strategies to work on achieving inclusion in your workplace. Strengthen your own awareness and appreciation for different perspectives. Go out there, do your research. Um, Create cultural awareness. Maybe talk about starting a book club, having a guest speaker, a lunch and learn, something like that. Promote healthy relationships and friendships among colleagues through social or community involvement. Provide each other with a safe space to voice concerns. Focus on effective conflict resolution techniques. Cultivate a work environment where people are treated with respect at all times. And consider celebrating important events, right? Not just US recognized holidays. So you could celebrate Juneteenth, Gay Pride, International Day of Person with Disabilities, International Women's Day. There are lots of reasons to celebrate our cultural and social differences. And it's okay to do that in the workplace. And just a couple final key takeaways. Think about doing your part to create a positive and inclusive working environment. Think about it a lot, right? Reflect your organizational values in every interaction. Be alert to inappropriate conduct and be quick to hold people accountable to inclusive behaviors. And then, of course, engage with your manager or HR right away if concerns come up. So before we move to our Q&A portion, I want to let you know about a deeper learning opportunity. So Starbucks in 2018 had a pretty embarrassing racial incident. So Starbucks said, how are we going to deal with this, right? It was all over social media and the news, et cetera. So they worked with experts at Arizona State University, and they created this 15-course curriculum that addresses bias. And it's not just racial bias. They talk about racial, ethnic bias, LGBTQ issues, gender bias, et cetera. And all these courses are free to the public, right? So it's not just for their employees. They're really cool courses. They're called the To Be Welcoming series, and you can get to them from Starbucks webpage, or you can go straight to tobewelcoming.com. Highly recommend. So let's go ahead and I'll start my video back up. Okay, great. So we have one question in our Q&A window. If you have any other questions, now's the time. Oh, great question. Can we get a link to the slides after this webinar? Yeah, yeah. We'll send out a recording and we'll send out the deck as well. So you'll have all of this information. So while I'm waiting to see if anyone else has a question to ask, I'll let you know once we end the session today, you'll be automatically redirected to a survey really quick. 2 minutes tops to just let us know, how we did today. Do you feel like the content was relevant to you and your workforce and your employees and coworkers? Was it valuable? And, do you have any suggestions for any other topics you'd like us to discuss? Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and give you guys back a few minutes in your day. Thank you all for joining today, and everyone have a great weekend. Thanks so much. Bye.